As a counselling psychologist in training, about a year away from completing my doctorate, one of the biggest questions that I get asked on a regular basis is what exactly is the difference between counselling psychology and clinical psychology? And at times it can be a really difficult question to actually answer, but on this week's episode of GetPsyched, we're going to be looking at the differences between counselling psychology and clinical psychology and how we can differentiate the two. Guys, welcome to another week's episode of GetPsyched, and like I said, this week we're going to be taking a look at the differences between counselling psychology and clinical psychology. The first thing I want to say here, guys, is that I'm actually really interested in your opinions on this topic. You might agree with some of my points, you might disagree with some of my points. Perhaps you're a clinical psychologist, perhaps you're a counselling psychologist, perhaps you're either one of those in training. I would be really interested to know what your perspectives were about the differences between clinical psychology and counselling psychology. And if you disagree with any of my points or agree, then make sure to comment on the video below. You can also comment on social media and let me know your perspectives. I also want to do my very best to try and remove as much bias as I possibly can with this topic to the greatest degree in which I can. As I'm a counselling psychologist in training, I'm going to try and be as clear as possible about the differences between the two and not try and be too biased towards counselling psychology. Now, the first things first, I think we need to go into a little bit of detail about what the two disciplines, counselling psychology and clinical psychology, are actually all about. Well, the first thing to say about counselling psychology is actually a very recent, it's quite a new form of psychology. It deals with all kinds of different mental health difficulties. And it's concerned with both therapy and research. Something called the scientist-practitioner model is a real key feature to counselling psychology, where a therapist both works in that one-to-one or group-based mental health work, but also looks at research, actually working as a scientist as well. That's one of the key things that actually differentiates counselling psychology from things like counselling or psychotherapy, is that scientist-practitioner model. There's also a pluralistic basis to counselling psychology. Now, pluralism basically means an appreciation and a training in all different kinds of therapy. Cognitive behavioural therapy, person-centred therapy, transactional analysis, psychodynamic therapy. All different kinds of therapy are important. A counselling psychologist is not just trained in one form of therapy, which is something that you might see in counselling or psychotherapy, for example. And although there's a pluralistic basis to counselling psychology, there is a humanistic underpinning. Now, this basically means that kind of person-centred humanistic values are the kind of foundation to counselling psychology. Don't get me wrong, there are some counselling psychologists that primarily work in cognitive behavioural therapy, for example, but a huge part of their identity is in that humanistic approach, in that humanistic appreciation. Counselling psychologists work privately, they work at universities, they work in medical centres and in all different kinds of mental health centres. There's of course an understanding of the mental health difficulties, the subjective understandings of those for the clients in particular, but there's also an understanding of the medicalisation of certain diagnoses. Now, whether or not counselling psychologists actively agree with those diagnoses or not, they are an appreciation, they do appreciate them, they understand them, or they have training in them at least. Now, we've looked at counselling psychology, why don't we take a little bit of a look at what clinical psychology is all about. Now, there's no doubt here, things are very similar. There's a lot of overlap between counselling psychology and clinical psychology. Again, we have that scientist-practitioner model, we have a therapeutic side and a research scientist side in clinical psychology. Clinical psychologists work predominantly in medicalised centres though, primarily in the NHS. There's also more of a focus on what's known as the medical model, where assessment procedures and diagnosis are very central to the work conducted by clinical psychology. That's one of the differences between the two. Assessments are a real key part to clinical psychologists' work, and counselling psychologists do this to a degree, but not to the same extent as clinical psychologists, it could be argued. So what exactly are the differences between counselling psychology and clinical? Now, the first thing I'm going to talk about is pluralism, which I've already mentioned. Now, it's important to reiterate what I've said. Pluralism is one of those key features that differentiates counselling psychology from things like counselling and psychotherapy, but it's also a key feature that does show some differences between counselling and clinical psychology. Now, before I go any further, I know very well that clinical psychologists are trained in a pluralistic sense, but I do think that they are executed, or pluralism is executed in a very different way between counselling psychology and clinical. Counselling psychology views pluralism as a stance in and of itself. With a reflective practitioner model, Utilising pluralism and an understanding of many different forms of therapy, a counselling psychologist can at times see themselves as their own mode of therapy, so to speak. So I've had training in person-centred, I've had training in cognitive behavioural therapy, I've had training in schema therapy. I utilise all those things, I amalgamate all those things to create my own stance. That's how pluralism is kind of executed in counselling psychology anyway. That's a very basic and foundational explanation. Clinical psychology can be argued to see that a little bit differently, that this pluralistic stance is seen as one or the other, so to speak. So if you have had training in cognitive behavioural therapy and perhaps some training in person-centred therapy, a clinical psychologist might utilise one or the other, for example. There's also humanism. Like I said earlier, humanism is a key identifying feature to counselling psychology. But it also illustrates a little bit of the differences between counselling psychology and clinical psychology. It's utilised very differently. So if a client comes to us with a previous diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, for example, the first thing a counselling psychologist should do is see the subjective individual, see the client as themselves, not necessarily as their diagnosis. Now, don't get me wrong, a counselling psychologist might utilise an understanding of that previous diagnosis, they might agree or disagree with it, but they might utilise it for the betterment of that client's treatment. That philosophical underpinning or that perception will depend on the subjective counselling psychologists themselves and how much they actually agree with diagnoses or not. Clinical psychology would see that diagnosis as more central and even perhaps work with that diagnosis in and of itself when they experience a client that has like a diagnosis of borderline personality disorder, for example. I think it's important to say that there are different opinions and different perspectives and appreciations of what diagnoses actually mean when we're looking at counselling psychology compared to clinical. Now, of course, after all that, you might be thinking as well, and it's absolutely true to say, there's a huge amount of overlap here. Things like the scientist-practitioner model, which is a key contributing factor to the identity of counselling psychology, is also shared by clinical psychology. Now, these overlaps are everywhere. The reflective practitioner model, pluralism, even these kind of things are overlaps between counselling and clinical. So as much as I can give you some identifying features to what it is about counselling that differs from clinical or what it is about clinical that differs from counselling, people are always going to have their different perspectives. And sometimes the changes or sometimes the differences can be very small, but can actually be really impactful when you work with a clinical psychologist or when you work with a counselling psychologist. Those differentiating factors can become quite apparent at times. There are a number of things to be aware of if you're considering counselling or clinical psychology, or when you're wanting to understand a little bit more about the differences between the two. The first thing to consider here is training. One of the key differentiating factors between counselling psychology and clinical psychology is the way that people are trained. Both are trained and both go on placement with advanced supervision. Counselling psychology is a little bit different in that often you'll be asked to have a certain number of personal therapy hours under your belt as you study the course. But in the UK currently, clinical psychology is a funded course with a £26,000 a year salary attributed to it, and counselling psychology is not funded. There have at times been talks actually of an amalgamation amongst psychology. The overlapping identity between counselling psychology and clinical psychology, and even the jobs that ask in the NHS anyway that look for clinical/counselling psychologists, have spoken more and more to this amalgamation between counselling and clinical psychology in particular. And actually in the British Psychological Society in the UK in of itself, there have been people arguing for an amalgamation of all disciplines of psychology, meaning that there would no longer be a counselling psychologist and a clinical psychologist or a health psychologist. They would just be identified as applied psychologists. I'm actually quite interested in what you think of this. In my view, I don't really see this as helping the client in any way, shape or form really. I kind of actually see it as a bit of a cop-out from some challenges that we actually have with our own identity, whether you're a counselling or clinical psychologist, and the issues that we have with that overlapping identity. I'm very, very, very proud of my counselling psychologist in training identity, and I don't want to sacrifice that just because we find it difficult to differentiate that between clinical psychology. I think also there are a number of common misconceptions between the two that need to be addressed. I think some of those misconceptions stem from the kind of hierarchical basis of clinical and counselling psychology. Now, often what can happen is that on training, and this has often been the case, I've heard this from colleagues and people that I study with, that clinical psychology is kind of put on a pedestal above counselling psychology. Now that can come in many different forms. A lot of people think that clinical psychologists are real psychologists and counselling psychologists are just therapists. I've also heard examples of trainees and even qualified individuals that are counselling psychologists on placement or in work who have been told that they're not allowed to work with certain kinds of people that have certain kind of diagnoses, and that those kind of things are often just reserved for clinical psychology. Now that often puts clinical psychology on this perceived pedestal that is not accurate. One of the common misconceptions that I want to address is that if you're a psychologist, then you're a psychologist. That's the level platform we're at. Clinical psychology is not above counselling, and counselling is not above clinical in any way. Actually, what you'll find in the NHS, which I actually even found quite surprising, is there are a lot of hierarchical positions, a lot of managerial positions in psychology in the NHS that are actually taken up by counselling psychologists. I also think there's a misconception here about the amalgamation between counselling psychology and psychotherapy. There's a lot of therapists out there, and I'm one day going to do a video actually on calling out not named people, but people that aren't actually qualified calling themselves therapists, counsellors, and even psychologists. And sometimes what can happen is that counselling psychology can kind of get wrapped into that mix where we think that counselling psychologists are basically just glorified therapists. That's absolutely not the case. What I talked to you earlier about the scientist practitioner model is the case. Counselling psychologists are researchers, they're scientists as well. I also want to kind of support clinical psychology in this as well. What happens sometimes in a misconception about clinical psychology is that it is just very clinical. And that's absolutely not the case. It's a really beneficial therapeutic aspect to clinical psychology too. I've worked with a number of clinical psychologists in my history, and they've all been fantastic psychologists. And not only have they had that expertise in research and science, just like counselling psychologists, but they also have vast training and understanding in the therapeutic sense as well. Again, very much like counselling psychology. I think one of the there's many different features for me, my own experience of being a counselling psychologist in training, that I think speak to some of the differences in clinical psychology compared to counselling. I say this at conferences sometimes, and I know that people disagree with me often, but one of the key defining differences for me actually is that I think in counselling psychology there's a greater option or opportunity to actually work privately if that's what you want to do. Clinical psychology very much focuses in on working in the NHS. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And of course, there are clinical psychologists who do work privately. But I think as a counselling psychologist, you are more attuned to working on that group-based or that one-to-one mental health way in a private sense. So if you're kind of thinking to yourself, I'm quite keen on private work, like me, I'm keen on private work in the future. It's one of the things that actually drove me to counselling psychology over clinical. Then counselling psychology might be the option for you. I also want to say, as much as you possibly can, try not to let funding or money decide what kind of psychology you want to do, what kind of psychologist you want to become. Don't get me wrong, that is going to have an influence to some degree, it's unavoidable at points. But just because counselling psychology is not funded and clinical psychology is, doesn't mean you should just go for clinical psychology. Again, I know I live in the real world and I know it's not as simple as that, and sometimes people do have to go for funded courses. But I think at least take a step back and consider your options and think, what kind of psychologist do I actually want to be? Okay guys, today we've been looking at a pretty difficult topic actually. It's been hard for me to speak on actually. I found this one pretty difficult. But we've been looking at the differences between counselling psychology and clinical psychology. Again guys, I'm really interested in your perspectives here. I know a lot of people are going to disagree with me, some people might agree, and you might be left with more questions than answers at the end of this video. But I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about your opinion, so why don't you drop me a comment on the video and I'll make sure to get back to you. And guys, thanks so much again for watching this week's episode of GetPsyched, and I'll hopefully catch you next week.